Howdy, folks. This is just a reminder that if you like this content, you can help me out by liking, commenting, and especially by subscribing. And be sure to hit the bell notification so you always get notified whenever I have a new video. Hope you enjoy this.
We are joined again today on the Classical Theism podcast with Jimmy Akin, who is senior apologist at Catholic Answers, a prolific author, debater, and Christian apologist who has done so much work defending the faith over the years. And we're about to talk about a topic today that we've not yet spoken about with Jimmy Akin on the show. But first, Jimmy Akin, welcome back to the Classical Theism podcast.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, John. Always a pleasure to speak with you.
So before we get into today's topic, I always like to ask guests what they've been up to lately. So what have you been working on as of late in terms of presentations, debates, or research?
Well, I can't really talk about all of it right now because I've got an announcement coming soon. So I'm going to be announcing a new project. But I've been doing a lot. I did several recent debates. I have some inquiries about further debates to do. I've been doing a lot of interviews on different people's programs here on YouTube and on their podcasts. I've been doing a lot of research on survival issues, meaning survival of bodily death. I've been researching a lot of death-related phenomena, and I also have been prepping for a couple of classes I'm teaching. One, which is probably just finishing up by the time this airs on your channel, on your podcast, because I know it's going to be a few weeks, is on Christianity and parapsychology. I'm teaching that for the Rhine Education Center. I also wrapped up teaching their Introduction to Parapsychology course a month or so ago. And this fall, this October, November, I'm going to be teaching for them religious perspectives on parapsychology. So I'm going to be surveying all the world religions, not just Christianity. And also I'm going to be teaching Introduction to Parapsychology again.
Fantastic. Well, really, a lot of that leads right into what we're going to be talking about today, but we'll stay tuned for that big announcment and the exciting stuff coming down the pike. But today I wanted to ask you about all that research that you've done, things that you've been teaching on, specifically regarding, the paranormal and the parapsychological, and also whether these ideas can relate to Christian apologetics. Like you said, you're surveying the world religions with them. You're also doing Christianity and parapsychology. So we're going to get into that today, but I want to start just first with some definitions of what these things are. What do the terms paranormal and parapsychological mean, and what do people in those fields study?
Okay, so we'll start with paranormal. Paranormal is a catch-all term that's used in our culture to refer to anything that is beyond what is considered normal in our culture. And so this is a culture-specific term because our culture considers some things normal and some things beyond the normal that others would consider the beyond, oh no, that's normal to us. And it varies over time as well as across cultures. It also varies within a culture like ours across time. For example, if you went back to the 1700s, let's say, and you're reading a newspaper, you would read accounts of ghosts in the newspaper as factual stories. There's a ghost appearing at this place, and here's what happened, and stuff like that. But these days, as a result of the ascendancy of scientific materialism in our culture, today that would be considered beyond the normal. And para in Greek is a preposition that just means beyond or alongside. And in this case, it means beyond. So paranormal is anything that is beyond what our culture considers normal. And that covers a whole range of things, not all of which are studied by parapsychologists. For example, miracles, like we believe in the Christian faith, those would be considered beyond the normal. So miracles would be one example of the paranormal. Apparitions of saints or ghosts, that would be considered beyond the normal. UFOs would be considered beyond the normal. Bigfoot would be considered beyond the normal. Psychic powers would be considered beyond the normal. So there's a whole bunch of different things that are considered paranormal. Not all of them are studied by parapsychology. Parapsychology, so we've got the para again, and in this case, it more or less means alongside. That's the other common meaning of para in Greek. Parapsychology is a field of study that is alongside psychology. It's not the same thing as psychology. Originally, it was part of psychology, but as psychology developed, it kind of split in two, and so you have psychology and then the study of things that are kind of alongside psychology. And in essence, parapsychology does deal with the human mind. That's why it's related to psychology, but it deals with different subjects about the human mind than conventional psychology does. And there are two principal areas that are studied by parapsychologists. The first is psychic functioning. Experiences that appear to involve things like clairvoyance, telepathy, psychokinesis, precognition, things like that, psychic functioning. That's the first area that parapsychology studies. The other is the survival of human consciousness beyond bodily death. So the two principal areas that parapsychology studies are psychic functioning and the survival of bodily death. And you can see how, well, those both involve the human mind, but they're not what conventional psychology studies. So that's why it's para. That also means that a lot of paranormal things are not studied by parapsychology. For example, miracles. Those would be left to religious studies, for example. UFOs, that would be left to ufology. Bigfoot, that would be left to cryptozoology. So there are other fields that study other paranormal things, but the two that parapsychology focuses on are psychic functioning and the survival of bodily death.
No, that's a helpful layout of the terms and also the etymology and what those mean. But I want to actually hit you with an objection right away, because some people hearing this, especially like you alluded to in our modern scientific culture, they'll say, these can't be legitimate fields of study. These just must be illegitimate fields based on some crank anecdotes and weird stuff that you heard your cousin or your uncle say, but they're not actual science. What do you think about that?
Well, I want to be tolerant of ordinary folks who would say such things because they've never studied the field. For people who fancy themselves to be scientifically educated to say such things, it's a whole nother matter, because for them, it's a case of not having done your homework. There are several responses that one would make. One of them is whether or not you believe in the reality of psychic functioning or the survival of bodily death, people report experiences that appear to involve them. And so there are genuine human experiences where people think they've had an insight into the future or read someone's mind, or they have a near-death experience. And these are part of the human experience, and therefore they do need to be studied, even if you don't believe that psychic functioning is real or that survival is real. These are reported experiences and they need to be studied. So that's kind of a content-based response. There's also a methodologically based response. And the methodologically based response is that parapsychologists use scientific method. They have observational data, they formulate hypotheses, they run experiments, and then they report their results. So those are the basic stages of the scientific method. And they use the scientific method. In fact, they're better at it than many people in other fields. You may know, for example, in medical testing, when someone's like experimenting on a new drug to see if the new drug is effective or not, the classic gold standard type study is a randomized control trial that is double-blinded. So neither the experimenter nor the patient knows whether they're getting the drug or whether they're getting the placebo. That's considered the gold standard in medical science. In parapsychology, there are experiments that are quintuple blinded. So nobody involved in the process has a complete picture until data collection is over. So actually, parapsychologists have been on the cutting edge of scientific methodology because they know that they're going to be subject to additional scrutiny, and so they have to make sure that their experiments are rigorously well designed. And as someone who sits in on parapsychological discussions, one of the things we do is look at studies and rip them apart in terms of methodology and say, what could they have done better? What needs to be done better in the future? And so the science is actually very rigorous in parapsychology. Also, the Parapsychological Association is a member of the American Academy for the Advancement of Science, which is the major professional organization for the different branches of science here in the United States. And so parapsychologists actually are very they're doing real science. They're doing it methodologically, they're taking it seriously, and they use the scientific method constantly.
I want to dig into that a little bit deeper, but I like those 2 points, or the two big overarching points. That one, just from the perspective of there are a lot of genuine human experiences where people report those things. What do you do with that data? Well, it deserves study, whether you end up affirming it or not. That's a fair thing and something that should be done. And then second, methodologically, they're using the scientific method, which we're going to get into. They're not just doing the famous Ghostbusters scene where he's holding up the different cards and having guess like whether it's a star or wavy lines and other things, and then just zapping someone if they agree or don't agree, which people probably have heard of and probably imagine.
Oh, yeah. And actually, it's based on something that did used to happen. Those cards with the 5 symbols, the cross, circle, square, triangle, wavy lines, those are often called Zener cards or ESP cards. And those were developed at the Duke Parapsychology Lab back in the 1930s by a man named Carl Zener. However, he didn't like them being called Zener cards because he didn't want his name forever associated with them. So they're also called ESP cards. These days, they're not really used. There are much better targets. There are some problems with using those symbols as targets, and also using physical cards is not as good as using a target that is, for example, randomly selected by a computer with a true random number generator, so there's no way to predict it. So these days, parapsychologists don't really use the Zener cards, but they did used to. Also, these days you'd have, because you've got to, if you're going to do an experiment, you got to run it past an institutional review board for ethical standards. And shocking people when they get it wrong is going to be harder to get past an institutional review board.
Very good, very good. No, and I like the point too that you made where these folks are going to be under more scrutiny because their field is already suspect by a variety of folks. They're going to be going that extra mile to make really, really rigorous and well-designed experiments. Whereas if you're in a field where everybody kind of already accepts your results anyway, you might get a little bit lax and a little willy-nilly with how you set up your designs because it's already pretty much taken at face value that these are typical conclusions. But let's drill into that a little bit further as far as, because you've spoken about these parapsychologists and that they do well-designed experiments. What kind of work do those researchers actually do? What's an example of something that they're going to be studying, and how do they do it?
Well, so there's a basic division in parapsychological research between laboratory experiments and field studies. Laboratory experiments are applied to phenomena that you can bring into a controlled laboratory setting and apply scientific controls to, and then do it over and over and over again and replicate it. That's distinct from non-laboratory or field studies. Field studies involve experiences that are hard to bring into the lab. And therefore hard to apply scientific controls to. This is similar to, for example, just to give a parallel involving other sciences, this is similar to like in medicine. There are some medical studies that are done where you can do research in the lab. You can bring people into a controlled setting and study them there. But you can't study everything in medicine that way, because a lot of things happen to people when they're not in a lab, like they get cancer or they get, the flu or something. And you can't just infect people on command ethically. So you have other medical studies that are more like population studies that are done in the field rather than in the laboratory. And the same thing happens in parapsychology. There are some phenomena like psychic functioning that are easy to bring into the lab and test. There are others, like let's say near-death experiences, that you can't really bring into the lab because it ain't ethical to kill people and see what kind of experience they have. So survival research tends to be more field study, and psychic research tends to be more laboratory study.
That's good, and that maps on pretty well to the distinction that I learned. So I'm a high school math teacher, most of the listeners know, but I actually didn't teach statistics too much, except for a couple of years, and they would often distinguish between, they would call it the words experiment, where the researchers are going to be imposing treatments on the subjects. And then they also had a separate discussion of observational studies, which field studies would be a part of that. And the famous example was always in our textbook, I still remember it. Does smoking cause lung cancer? Does smoking cigarettes cause lung cancer? And it would not
can't test that in a lab.
Experiment and say, hey, all right, all of you start smoking all these packs of cigarettes and you people don't, and then we'll see who gets cancer. And they were like, because that can't be done, they have to approach it in a different way with population studies and different correlations and things of that sort. So given that, why don't we get into a little bit more specifics? Can you describe for us, by the way, I don't even know how to grasp quintuple blind. So you don't necessarily have to go into that one, but I'm curious about like what would be an example of how they would study, let's say, some of the psychic functioning.
Okay, so let's take a simple example that's been very well validated. It's a procedure known as the Ganzfeld. Ganzfeld is a German term, and it means whole field. It's a term from psychology. And basically, in parapsychology, a Ganzfeld experiment is a kind of telepathy test in its classic form. What you do is you've got, and by the way, this grew out of sleep studies at the Moses Maimonides Dream Laboratory in New York at Moses Maimonides Medical Hospital back in like the 70s. They did a whole bunch of dream telepathy studies where you'd have somebody who is asleep and someone else, while that person is dreaming, tries to send them an image. And then the sleep researchers wake the person up and say, what were you just dreaming about? And they got positive results with this, beyond random chance. The dreamers were dreaming about imagery that were reporting imagery that was being sent to them that they had no idea what the target was going to be. But there's a problem with dream research. It's a pain in the butt because the dreamer gets woken up and then they got to fall asleep again, and you get maybe 1 or 2 trials a night, and they've got a bad night of sleep. And the sender who's trying to send them the mental image, they don't get to sleep at all. And the researchers who got to wake them up, they don't get to sleep. So there are high costs on the human level associated with dream telepathy research. So what they did was they said, maybe we can do something like this in an easier way. So they came up with what's known as the Ganzfeld procedure, and it underwent modification over time. But basically the way it works today is you've got one person sitting in one room who's the sender. That person is shown an image or a video on a computer that is randomly selected with a true random number generator. So the sender has no idea what they're supposed to send until the video appears on their screen. And then for 20 minutes, they concentrate on the video that's playing over and over in front of them, and they try to send it to the receiver. The receiver is in a different room, and the room that the receiver is in is a Faraday cage. So it blocks all incoming electromagnetic signals, and it's also soundproof. So there's no way for sound to get between the two rooms. It's very isolated. In the receiver room, the receiver is sitting in a chair in a relaxed posture. Typically it's a recliner, and they at first listen, they've got headsets on, and they may listen to some instructions first, but then it switches over when the experiment begins to them listening to white noise or pink noise, which is basically the same thing as white noise, but with certain frequencies removed, so it's a little softer to listen to. And that blocks out any audio distraction, so they're not listening to stuff going on around them. They're not hearing the ticking of a clock or anything like that. So nothing to distract them in terms of sound. They also have ping pong balls that have been cut in half and taped over their eyes, and they have a red light shining on their face. And what that does is, it doesn't matter if they open their eyes, they're going to see a blank red field. If they close their eyes, they're going to see a blank red field. So they have no visual distractions. And so they're sitting here in a relaxed, what they're doing is they're imitating sleep without really putting you to sleep. You're laying here in a relaxed posture. You got audio distractions cut out. You got video distractions cut out. And then for 20 minutes, you just narrate what's going on in your mind.
This is all part of the Ganzfeld.
This is all Ganzfeld. Yeah. So you just narrate what's going on in your mind, and they tape record it. And then after the experiment is over, there is a two-stage judging process that occurs. What they do is they come to you, the receiver, and they say, here are 4 pictures. One of them is the real target. The other 3 are decoys, and they show these to you on a computer screen, and they've been randomly sorted, so there's no preferred position to pick. And what your job is as the receiver is to say which one of these pictures most closely corresponds to what you perceived as you were trying to receive the signal from the other person. And since there's 4 pictures, you got a 1 in 4 chance of guessing correctly, 25%. That's the first stage of the judging process. Then what they do is they take the same 4 pictures in a random order and show them to blind independent judges who do not know what the correct target is. And they give the blind judges a transcript of everything you narrated while you were trying to receive. And the blind judges are supposed to look at the transcript and say which one of the 4 pictures does it most match. There being 4 pictures, 25% chance the judges are going to guess it correct randomly. So if we see that the actual hit rate is higher than 25%, which is what random chance would dictate, that would be evidence that there is a psychic effect happening here. And it so happens over and over again. And the people participating in these experiments are not professional psychics. They're not trained in a psychic discipline. They're just ordinary people who volunteered to do this. And with just ordinary people taking the test, not trained psychics, the actual hit rate is 1 in 3.
No.
Not 1 in 4. So it's not a big effect, but it is there. And these people are untrained. They're not skilled practitioners in any form of psychic practice. So even just ordinary people are displaying this characteristic beyond random chance to a measurable degree in a consistent way. So that's one example of a kind of laboratory experiment that's been done. There are others too. In fact,
and is this documented? Like, do they write this up?
Oh yeah,
put it in a journal somewhere?
Oh yeah, peer reviewed journals. Yeah, absolutely. And there have been numerous replications of Ganzfeld. Another more recent set of experiments was done by a man named Daryl Bem, B-E-M. Now, Daryl Bem did not start out as a parapsychologist. He started out as a psychiatrist, and a high-level one. He was very highly respected in psychiatry. But he was brought in to do some consultant work on some parapsychological experiments, and he got interested in the field. And so he decided, I'm going to take some standard psychiatry experiments and just modify them so that they could test something parapsychological. And so, to give an example, one of the experiments that's standard in psychology is a memory test. What they do is they show you a list of like 50 words. You get exposed to these 50 words once, and then they split the list in half. And they give you half of the list and say, now practice with these 25 words. And then, after you've practiced with half of the list, they say, tell us all the words you can remember from all of the 50. Well, needless to say, you're going to remember the 25 you practiced better than the 25 you didn't practice. So people will have more of that. So what Daryl Bem did was say, let's just flip the order. We'll show you the 50 words, and then we'll ask you to name as many as you can remember, and then we'll let you practice with 25 of them and see what you do. Well, it turns out that people would remember more of the words that they would practice in the future that they had not yet practiced than the words they would not practice in the future. So this is essentially doing your homework after you've taken the test. And it showed a real effect. People could. Just like in a standard test, you remember the words you had practiced better than the words you hadn't. In Daryl Bem's test, people remembered the words they would practice better than the words they would not practice. So that was one of his experiments. He also did other things too, like he would do a surprise test, and you don't electrically shock people these days typically, but you can play a loud noise and turn on a bright light and things like that to generate a startle reflex. And he would measure the people's galvanic skin response before, during, and after this. And it turns out that if he was about to startle people, they would begin reacting to, their galvanic skin response would start spiking 3 seconds before the startle event would happen. And the startle events were randomly selected by computer. So they had no idea when the startle events were going to happen, and yet people started getting ready for it about 3 seconds before it actually happened. So it was another precognitive effect. He published the results of his studies in a paper called Feel in the Future, and in a high-end psychological journal, and not even a parapsychological journal, a regular psychological perceptual journal. And the conventional skeptical, scientific materialism world freaked out. And they said, there's got to be something wrong here. This all needs to be replicated. Well, it so happens Daryl Bem had programmed all of this into a computer package that anybody could download and replicate in their own laboratory. So people did. And within 2 years, you had like 90 replications with the same results. And then the skeptical community started writing articles like, Daryl Bem has just proved that ESP is real, and that means science is broken. Because they were so determined to reject the existence of ESP that they would conclude something must be wrong with science in general. Not what he did, because they vetted that, but he's using only standard scientific statistical procedures, and he's getting this unacceptable result. So that means science itself is broken.
This is incredible stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I want to see. Let me probe in two ways here, because what I was going to ask is, do the researchers simply stop where they've detected their phenomena, write up their methodological conclusions, and say, okay, this is the rate expected just by chance, this is the rate we obtained, this is what we would expect if there's nothing parapsychological going on in the Bem experiment, say, and yet this is what we found in the feeling the future type stuff? Mm-hmm. Or do they go further and suggest explanations of the phenomena, or do they kind of leave it open-ended just when they're doing their scientific research? Because where I think I am curious to go next is, do the parapsychologists themselves propose explanations for why these things are occurring, or do they kind of remain agnostic on that and then just keep designing experiments?
Okay, first I want to clear up a possible confusion, because I thought you were going to ask about one thing and someone else may have wondered the same thing. So you asked, do they just stop at a certain point? No. in terms of the trials they do. As part of the experimental design, they say, here's how many trials we're going to do. And that's determined ahead of time. And what that does, and these studies are, the experimental designs are often pre-registered, which is another thing that parapsychologists do that other scientists tend not to. They tend not to pre-register what they're going to do with a publication that notes such things. And what that allows non-parapsychologists to do is engage in a practice known as optional stop-in. Optional stop-in is what happens when I just got the results I wanted. I'm going to stop testing now. And that's bad science, because you can get any result you want if you get to optional stop and determine when you're going to quit testing. So what parapsychologists do is they say, this is how many we're going to do, and then they do that number. So there is no optional stop-in involved.
I like that a lot. I also want to just piggyback on one other thing too. This pre-register thing sounds great, because otherwise what happens is you get people who just want to get published so badly. And I think you talked about this on a previous show with the file folder effect.
The file drawer effect, yeah.
Yeah, let's say 9 studies didn't show any, cause and effect in this thing that you were studying, but then one of them did. Well, the one that you did gets all the attention, and that's what you're going to go publish. But people don't see, wait a minute, 9 of these other ones just found nothing going on, and they were just ignored because they never got published. Well, pre-registering your design, let's say with an institution, with a paper, with a journal, that can help take care of some of that, which is good. Yeah.
Also, parapsychological journals, unlike conventional journals, do publish replications, including null replications. I've got a copy of the Journal of Parapsychology right over here, or actually, I think it's the Journal for the Society of Psychical Research, and they published a study by a well-known British researcher, and he said, okay, we did this test and we got chance results. So, they rigorously steer clear of the file drawer effect.
I'll get back to the explanation thing in a second. I just wanted to add one other thing too. And when Jimmy says they got chance results too, they are measuring statistically in a reasonable way. If the expectation is 25% by chance and it's like 25.02%, they're not saying, aha, we win. No, there's measurements to these as to what counts as statistically significant. And it's not just any little bit over the expected chance result, but it has to be
typically 2 standard deviations away from the mean.
It has to be a large enough effect size to say, okay, this is not plausibly due to random chance. So that was good. And you talked about they have to pre-register, and also that they're not just arbitrarily stopping when they quote unquote get a result that they want. And then now we're going to go into, do they offer explanations, or do they tend to just stop after they have their data?
So it depends on the researchers involved. Some researchers are just interested in doing a test. They've got a hypothesis. They do the test. They report their results. Others are more theoreticians. And so, like in a journal in almost any subject, you'll have some papers that are data-driven, some that are theory-oriented, and some that are a mix of the two. At the current stage of parapsychology, we're basically at the position that biology was in before Darwin, or that chemistry was in before Mendeleev. So what happened in biology was you had a whole bunch of people, they're studying animals and plants, they're classifying them. You had Carl Linnaeus putting together his family tree of organisms and stuff, but they didn't have a central theory to explain all the differences, and that's what Darwin produced. Now, there were evolutionary theorists before Darwin, but he produced one that stuck, although it's subsequently been modified. Similarly, with Mendeleev in chemistry, people had noticed, hey, certain elements seemed, they were discovering all these elements, chemical elements, and they noticed that ones that had certain masses tended to be similar to other ones that had similar but lesser or greater masses. And they didn't know why this was. And eventually, Dmitry Mendeleev put it all together in an early version of what's now known as the periodic table. And so that provided a central sort of theory, if you will, to explain this larger array of phenomena that people were encountering. And so that simplified the study of chemistry the same way evolution simplified the study of biology. Well, we're currently in the pre-settled theory stage in parapsychology, to where there's a lot more observational studies being done, a lot of poking and prodding to see, does this variable affect it or does that variable affect it? And there is some thought that is given to different theoretical aspects of this, but we don't have a central overarching theory yet. However, there are preliminary theories to explain notable chunks of the data. One of them, for example, is known as first sight theory. And first sight theory basically proposes, and there's good experimental evidence for this, that all people have some degree of psychic functioning that they use all the time. It's just part of the background of human experience. We don't even notice it. And what happens is people are, we're organisms. We navigate our environment, and we have senses, the physical senses, that take information about our environment and turn them into electrochemical signals that get sent to our subconscious, and then there's a selection process that goes on of, does the conscious mind become aware of it or not? And the conscious mind, it has executive functions to make decisions. And so not everything we sense is presented to our conscious minds. We would go nuts if we consciously had to think about everything we sense from every nerve on our bodies all the time. So what happens is, our subconscious does a filtering process to eliminate the stuff that the conscious mind doesn't need to worry about. That's why after you sit down in a chair, after a minute or two, you stop feeling, the pressure on your butt from the chair, because it's not relevant to your current experience. Similarly, if you walk into a bakery and at first there's this amazing bread smell. Well, you're not going to be smelling the bread 5 minutes from now. What the senses tend to present to the conscious mind is information that's changing and new and relevant. And then once it becomes standard, the subconscious phases that stuff out so you don't really perceive it. Well, the basic proposal is we also have psychic functioning happen to help us learn about and navigate our environment, and mostly it gets handled as at the subconscious level, and only periodically does it percolate up into the conscious mind. And so that's why, for example, putting someone in an altered state of consciousness, like going to sleep or relaxing without any distractions, that would allow more of the psychic signal to bubble up into the conscious mind.
Okay, and that's called first sight theory. Yeah.
That's just one example. There are other theories too, bunches of them, in fact.
Okay, so we talked a lot about psychic functioning and the ways that has been studied in different ways. Do you want to say a little bit about the near-death experience phenomena? Because some people, again, they might just expect that, these are just, self-reported stories that are told by someone and passed down and maybe sold in books to try to make money, but there's no actually real scientific studies that can be done on these near-death experiences. How do the researchers look at that aspect?
Okay, so there's actually a whole bunch of different areas involved in survival studies. It's not just near-death experiences. And I've done a lot of work in survival studies. The three kinds of experiences that I tend to focus on occur before, during, and after clinical death. Before death, there are widely reported phenomena that are known as deathbed visions, where people begin to perceive something of the afterlife while they're still alive. They may be in pain from their disease, and then as they're getting ready to die, the pain shuts off and their mood lifts, and they start seeing a bright light, and they start hearing music, and they start seeing the figures of departed loved ones or angels coming to escort them into the afterlife. And sometimes they get information about the afterlife or the future. through these deathbed visions. And this, incidentally, is something that has been recognized for centuries. In fact, if you read his dialogues, Pope St. Gregory the Great, a doctor of the church, talks about deathbed visions and how sometimes the dying are given a vision of the future as they're preparing to die, and they can communicate this information to other people. So this is something that the Catholic tradition has recognized. Then there are near-death experiences where someone either clinically dies or almost dies, and they nevertheless have a conscious experience. Now, these did happen historically, because there are cases where someone goes into cardiac arrest and their heart stops, and then it spontaneously restarts. So that does happen. That's a known phenomenon, and it did happen in history. And if you go back into, say, the writings of the Venerable Bede, he has an account of a man who had this happen to him, and it reads very much like a modern account. But in the 1960s, here in the United States, we developed techniques to enable us to restart someone's heart. And so that led to an explosion of these experiences now that we could actually bring people back. The first book on the subject was Raymond Moody's Life After Life, which came out in 1975. And since then, there has been a ton of research done on near-death experiences. There have been thousands of them that have been cataloged and described. Now, there are some hoaxers out there. And I can name several off the top of my head if you want me to, but there are hoaxers in every area of life. And so when near-death experiences began to be popular, some folks decided to put out books about near-death experiences they personally had had. Well, that's a danger sign, because a typical near-death experience is short. It is not enough to fill a book. And so anyone who's putting out a book about their personal experience, at a minimum, has a very unusual, atypical experience that does not represent the phenomenon in general. And it's also a sign they may be a hoaxer looking to make money. So there have been hoax books put out like that. And I routinely, if someone has a "here's what happened to me" book, I immediately am suspicious of it. Because at a minimum, it's not a typical experience, it's atypical. So it's not going to represent what happens to most people. What I do instead is I focus on books that are not written by the person who had the experience, so they're not making any money on it, and they contain typically dozens or hundreds of case accounts. So they give you a much broader representation of the phenomenon. Then the third type of phenomena that I've been studying recently occurs after death, and these are known as spontaneous after-death communications, or ADCs, and they are astonishingly common. According to current estimates, between 40 and 50% of the population reports having a spontaneous ADC at least once in their life. So that's basically half of people report having an ADC. And they come in a variety of different forms. They engage different human senses. Sometimes it's vision, sometimes it's hearing, sometimes it's both, sometimes it's olfactory. Sometimes you don't even know that the person isn't physical until they just vanish. It's not like they're transparent or glowing or something like that. You just see this person, and then it turns out they're no longer with us. People also get unusual information, and they get that across all three experiences. They get information they had no natural way of knowing, and it turns out to be true, and it's specific enough that it's beyond random chance. And in parapsychology, that's known as veridical information. So all three of these types of experiences have common elements, and to my mind, that mutually reinforces their evidential value. People tend to report the same sort of things in deathbed visions that they report in near-death experiences and that they report in after-death communications.
I think that's a helpful layout of the territory, but also a really key principle to keep in mind, that just because some people are hoaxers and found out, let's say, doesn't entail that every scenario and every piece of data can therefore be chalked up to a hoax.
No, you'd have to check out all of science, because there are scientists who are hoaxers in every field.
That's a great point. That's a great point to remember. And so it's helpful to know that you would advise us, maybe steer clear of the people writing about themselves and in a book length format. If your goal is to come up with some highly evidential material, stick to the more serious studies, books that have dozens of accounts, and they're done by not the people who are just telling them to make money, but by actual researchers who want to fairly look at the evidence. So I think that much is very, very helpful. I wonder if I should have you say the names of maybe at least one or two so that people just know to avoid the books, or is it something you'd prefer not to?
Oh, no, I'm happy to. Alex Malarkey, Daniel Brinkley, and Betty Eady are three off the top of my head that have strong marks of hoaxing.
That's good to know. So let's avoid those if we're looking to get into this field and use this as evidence, because we've talked a lot today, Jimmy, about psychic functioning and survival studies. Did you want to add? Well,
no, go ahead.
Okay, I would say I'm just kind of carving it up with the two big things you gave us: psychic functioning and then survival studies, and then more specifically, we had the before, during, and after death phenomenon that you've examined. And I kind of want to draw it now towards the subject of apologetics, and whether these fields or these studies, obviously you've spent a lot of time looking into these, you're going to be teaching classes on some of the phenomena. Do they have any relevance for Christian apologetics? And if so, how do you think so?
Well, they do. And this has actually been something that has been noted for decades, that there's an intersection between parapsychology and religion. J.B. Rhine, who was the most famous American parapsychologist in the 20th century, he considered going into the ministry, actually, at one point, and he ended up becoming a parapsychologist. But then, he reflected on that parapsychology does have something to say about subjects that are beyond the material. And, if it's true, for example, that psychic functioning is real, it's hard to fit that into we are just molecules made of atoms that are made of electrons, protons, and neutrons model. And if survival of bodily death happens, that's even more directly in religion's territory. And so that's why, for example, we have at the Rhine Institute the course I'm going to be teaching this fall on religious perspectives on parapsychology, and why I'm doing the Christianity and parapsychology course right now, because there's a lot of intersection between the two fields. I'm also going to be exploring this intersection in my apologetics work. Now, I do that to some degree on Mysterious World, at mysterious.fm if people want to check out Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, or my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. But I'm actually going to be integrating it into a more conventional apologetics. I'm preparing to write an apology for the Christian faith. That is a book-length defense of the Christian faith. And I'm going to be incorporating parapsychological material in it, specifically near-death experiences, as well as deathbed visions and after-death communications. That's going to be chapter 1 of the book. I'm going to start with a very dramatic incident that is real, that happened in the 1970s. It's, say, 1977 or whatever the year was, and a woman named Maria is dying. Maria was a migrant worker from Latin America. She had moved to the Pacific Northwest, and she went into cardiac arrest. So they took her to the hospital. She didn't really speak English, and back then it was not as common to have hospital workers who could speak Spanish. But Maria was in cardiac arrest. She was in the hospital. She began to have a typical NDE, where she experiences what's known as autoscopy, which is viewing your own body. So she's like floating above and looking down at her own body and looking at the doctors and nurses working on her, and she sees the printouts and stuff like that. And then she starts to move around the hospital out of her body. And she sees that on an upper floor, there is, on a ledge outside of a window, there is a blue men's tennis shoe with scuff marks and the shoelace wrapped around it. And it's like such an odd thing to see out on a ledge outside a window on an upper floor of the hospital. Well, they get her heart started again, and she's back in her body. And she, as soon as she's recovered enough, she starts trying to talk to somebody about her experience, but none of them speak Spanish. So they find a hospital worker who knows, her name was Kimberly Clark, if I recall correctly, who knows a little bit of Spanish. And they bring her in, and she's telling her all about her experience and the shoe. And she says, "Go find the shoe." And so Kimberly goes looking for it. And she starts going around upper floors and looking out the windows, and there's the shoe. And she's able to open the window and get the shoe and bring it back and show it to Maria that, yes, you were not crazy. You really saw this. Okay, all of this happened while Maria's heart was shut down, and there was no blood flow. No regular blood flow go into her brain. And in order to be conscious, we have to have blood flow to our brain constantly. Once your heart stops, you've got maybe 10 seconds, 15 seconds before you go unconscious. And so despite the fact that Maria was clinically dead and without blood flow to her brain, she had this out-of-body experience where she saw the shoe that was later retrieved. And this is veridical information that came back with her from her near-death experience. She had no way of guessing that this would be the case, so it's too specific to be random chance, and for random chance to be a plausible explanation. And so we've got some good evidence that consciousness is not strictly dependent on the body and that it can survive death, at least for a while. And so if that's true, we need to plan for the afterlife, and that's my entry point into my apology for the Christian faith.
Wow, that is a really incredible entry point, and that story, I had heard vague parts of it before, but hearing it in that detail is super interesting. We're definitely looking forward to that work. I want to say just one quick Christian objection, though, to these near-death experiences and these phenomena would be, well, doesn't St. Paul say, or in Hebrews it says that it's appointed that men die once and then comes judgment. So are these near-death experiences in conflict with Scripture, which says, no, you're just supposed to die once and then you're judged? You're not supposed to float outside of a hospital window and see a tennis shoe.
Well, then Lazarus broke the model, and so did the widow of Jairus' son, and Jairus' daughter and the widow of Nain's son, because we've got people in Scripture who died more than once. So the statement in Hebrews is a general norm, but it is not an exceptionalist one. In fact, there are even exceptions in Scripture for people who didn't die at all, like Enoch and Elijah.
All right, very good. Well, Jimmy, what are some episodes you would recommend? We're coming to the end of our time here. Just this intro, I would call this an introduction to parapsychology and its relation to Christian apologetics, at least on our podcast when it airs. But I'm curious, if people want to look more into this, what are a couple of episodes, maybe 2 or 3, of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World that you would recommend, particularly for Christians who want to look more into these ideas and how they might be useful in their apologetics for the faith?
Well, I've got a whole bunch of episodes of Mysterious World that deal with subjects like this, so it's kind of hard to narrow them down. One that I think is kind of a foundational episode is episode 79 on religion, magic, psychic phenomena, and science, where I talk about those 4 concepts and define them and how they're different and how they're similar. So that's a good kind of foundational episode. Also, episodes 105 and 106 on St. Thomas Aquinas and the occult are good. Then there's loads of ones involving stories about particular experiences. Some of the recent ones that I've done, with near-death experiences, a lot of people only hear about the positive ones, and they're just like, well, what? Didn't anyone ever go to hell? Yeah, they do. Episode 292 on distressing near-death experiences, turns out about 1/5 of all near-death experiences are distressing. Also, episodes 306 and 307 on after-death communications, and episode 318 on deathbed visions. Also, just for fun, episode 298 on pet telepathy. It is surprising what evidence there is that some of our pets may be in mental contact with us. And I've actually got a video footage of an experiment with a parrot where the owner is looking at photographs out in a different room where the parrot is, and they've got a camera on the parrot, and the parrot is narrating what the owner's looking at.
That's wild. I might have to see that. That alone got me interested in episode 298. I will make sure to link to a bunch of those.
And they're all easy to get to if you just go to mysterious.fm/the episode number. It'll take you right to that episode.
Perfect. Well, Jimmy Akin, thanks again for joining us on the Classical Theism podcast. And like you said, mysterious.fm /the number, but just let listeners know, where should they go to find out more about your work and all that you're up to? Like you said, you got some big announcements and things coming up. Just let them know, and I'll put that in the show notes before we say goodbye.
Okay, so I work for Catholic Answers, where I'm a senior apologist and a senior employee. That's Catholic.com. My personal website is JimmyAkin.com. And also, I invite folks to come to my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/JimmyAkin. And while you're there, I am trying to grow my channel. So please subscribe and hit the bell notification so you always get notified whenever I have a new video.
Fantastic. Well, I'll have those in the show notes page as well. Jimmy Akin, thanks again for joining us today. It's been a blast.
My pleasure. And before we go, just one more reminder that if you like what you've watched, you can help me out by liking, commenting, and especially by subscribing. I'm trying to grow my channel, and I'd really appreciate your help. Thank you, and God bless you.